Hello, and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your one-stop shop for the wide world of cinema from Eastern Europe. Subscribers gain access to our ever-evolving library of classic and contemporary films, as well as access to filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, essays, watch lists, and more. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial today at klassiki.online. For this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be reading from one of our Klassiki companions, a series of articles that you can find now on our journal page at klassiki.online/journal. The Klassiki companion is our beginner's guide to the key filmmakers, movements and concepts in the cinema of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia. Today, I'll be reading from our companion to the cinema of Poland in the 1980s. The last decade of communist rule was a period marked by the brutality of martial law and associated censorship, but also the emergence of critical new voices and masterpieces from figures like Andrzej Wajda, Agnieszka Holland, and Krzysztof Kieślowski. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to explore our collection of classic Polish titles and some of the films mentioned in this episode. For the nation's filmmakers, the final years of communist rule in Poland proved a period of both brutality and opportunity. A decade that opened with the imposition of martial law and ended with the apotheosis of the Solidarity trade union movement and the collapse of the regime. Emigration and repatriation, both enforced and voluntary, brought directors in and out of the fold. New voices emerged as established auteurs adapted to rapidly shifting times. The potential for political critique opened up and was shut down again. Films now recognized as canonical were shelved for years at a time. In this environment, artistic and political pressures were intertwined. The second half of the 1970s had seen the rise of a loose grouping of critical voices, later dubbed the Cinema of Moral Anxiety, a staging ground for the early works of major figures including Agnieszka Holland, Krzysztof Kieślowski, and Krzysztof Zanussi. These films had explored discontent in a minor key, using provincial settings and unremarkable protagonists as a means to dig under the skin of communist society. The economic decline that helped to fuel this melancholic worldview only worsened into the 80s, with rationing, shortages, and power outages prompting ever greater disillusionment with the authorities, most famously in the August 1980 strike at the Gdansk shipyards that announced the birth of Solidarity. Facing growing discontent, newly installed First Secretary Wojciech Jaruzelski imposed martial law on the 13th of December 1981. Although it was officially lifted in the summer of 1983, the battle lines had been drawn for the decade to come. Among the many repressive measures introduced with martial law, from paramilitary patrols and a national curfew to widespread wiretapping, was a tightening of cultural censorship. As a result, some of the most symbolically significant films of the early 80s received little to no domestic exposure until the end of the decade. Perhaps the most emblematic such case was Andrzej Wajda's Man of Iron from 1981. In 1977, Wajda had made his own contribution to the cinema of moral anxiety with Man of Marble, a dissection of the propaganda myths of the Stalinist 1950s. 4 years later, he followed up with an ad hoc sequel that was not just a historical drama, but a historical artifact in its own right. In August 1980, Wajda, a cultural celebrity in Poland, a living link to the radical days of the Polish film school, had visited Gdansk's Lenin shipyards to capture strikes that would give rise to the Solidarity Union. A labourer who was escorting him around the shipyard suggested that he make a sequel to Man of Marble about these strikes, and even proposed a title, Man of Iron. Realizing that the window to release such a film might be shut at any moment, Wajda hurried into action, recruiting screenwriter Alexander Szybor-Rilski, shooting and editing at breakneck pace in order to premiere at Cannes in May 1981. In the words of the critic Jonathan Bousfield, Wajda was extremely aware that social protest was a public spectacle of short duration, and that by making a film of the Gdansk events, he was helping to ensure that they would resonate for a long time. The film scooped the Palme d'Or, sparking excitement back in Poland. Never before has a film been awaited with such interest and anticipation, the Polish magazine Przekrój declared on the 23rd of August, ahead of its nominal domestic release. But the imposition by the authorities of martial law in December cut this enthusiasm short. The same fate, being lauded at a major European festival, but pulled from Polish screens a few weeks after release, also befell Wojciech Marczewski's Shivers, also from 1981. At the dawn of the 1980s, Marczewski was one of the most promising young directors in the country. His early features Nightmares and Steward marking him out as a stylist of unusual force, with a keen sense for period atmospheres and psychological intensity. Solidarity's challenge to the prevailing order reminded Marczewski of the so-called thaw of the late 50s, when he was a child, and he attempted in Shivers to re-examine the Stalinist era with a withering perspective that had simply not been feasible for filmmakers up to that point. Again, a few weeks after the film premiered to positive reviews, martial law was imposed. The film was pulled from cinemas and Marczewski refused to work for state studios for the remainder of the communist era. Shivers would later win a Silver Bear at the 1982 Berlinale. The impulse to draw parallels between the strictures of the 1980s and the Stalinist period was widely felt. Ryszard Bugajski's interrogation from 1982 about the forced confession of an innocent woman was another feature to be banned under martial law, only released in 1989. The same year, Janusz Zaorski's The Mother of Kings, about a loyal party member who falls foul of the post-war purges of the 1940s, suffered the same fate. The cinematic aftershocks of martial law were not confined to Poland itself. By the 1980s, there was a rich tradition of Polish filmmakers travelling in and out of the country as political pressure and artistic intent demanded, although the tightening of the border after 1981 meant that immigration at that point usually indicated at least semi-permanent exile. This was the case with the great Jerzy Skolimowski, who had come up with Wajda and everyone else in the Polish film school in the early 1960s, worked abroad for most of the 70s, and returned to his homeland for the 1981 feature Hands Up, an anti-Stalinist autobiographical tale that saw him finally forced out of the country until the fall of communism. Setting up shop in the UK, Skolimowski responded in typically droll fashion with his 1982 comedy Moonlighting, which stars Jeremy Irons as Novak, the head of a Polish building crew working illegally in London, who decides to conceal the truth about martial law and the crisis back home from his team. In the 1970s, the cinema of moral anxiety had not been a monolithic grouping, nor was Polish cinema of that era by any means uniformly critical. Accounts of the period do agree, though, that martial law marked a definitive endpoint to the nascent tendency. The leading voices of the moral anxiety movement each responded to the historical moment in their own way. Agnieszka Holland, who had studied in Prague under the influence of the Czech New Wave, and learned her trade as an assistant, first to Krzysztof Zanussi and later Andrzej Wajda on Man of Marble, had only made her feature debut in 1979 with Provincial Actors, incidentally starring director Tomasz Zygadło, who was another figurehead of the moral anxiety movement. Her next two features, Fever and A Lonely Woman, from 1980 and 81 respectively, both incurred the anger of the authorities. The former for its depiction of the Russian forces that occupied Poland in the 1900s. The latter for the social critique embedded into its feminist exploration of daily struggle in suburban Wrocław. Holland left Poland for France on the eve of martial law, and was unable to speak to her daughter for almost a year. Krzysztof Zanussi, who had already made a name for himself at the end of the 1960s with his film The Structure of Crystal, began the 80s on a high note when his typically acute psychological drama The Constant Factor won the jury prize at the 1980 Cannes Festival. Aware of the artistic consequences of martial law, Zanussi travelled for work throughout the 80s to Germany, Italy, and Canada. Unlike Holland, however, he was welcomed back to Poland several times, including to direct A Year of the Quiet Sun in 1984, a Venice Prize-winning war drama about the romance between a Polish woman and an American soldier starring Scott Wilson that proved that some degree of international collaboration remained viable throughout the decade. In 1979, Zanussi had appeared as himself in Krzysztof Kieślowski's The Camera Buff. For many, it was Kieślowski who had set the terms for the moral anxiety movement in films such as The Scar and The Calm, to say nothing of his groundbreaking and controversial documentary work earlier in the 70s. And it was Kieślowski who carried that ethos of humanist critique into the hard times of the 1980s. His friendship with Holland and his uncertain political loyalties meant that he did not avoid censure. His 1981 sliding doors drama Blind Chance was only released in 1987 and then in a heavily recut version. No End, his daring 1985 legal drama about the trials that followed the imposition of martial law, came in for heavy criticism from the authorities, including the Catholic Church. It was while researching No End that Kieślowski met the lawyer Krzysztof Pisiewicz, together with whom he would embark on his grandest project. Made for Polish television, funded by West German investors, and conceived in the atmosphere of comparative licentiousness of the late 1980s, Decalogue is Kieślowski's contemporary spin on the Ten Commandments. Consisting of 10 hour-long episodes, each of which is set in the same dilapidated Warsaw Tower block, with an overlapping ensemble cast, Decalogue probes the ethical dilemmas of late socialism, locating both the local and the universal relevance of scripture. The result is one of the pillars of Polish film history, a melancholy triumph at the end of a dispiriting decade. It was also the last of Kieślowski's purely Polish features. His final projects, The Double Life of Veronique and the Three Colours trilogy, were produced in France. While Kieślowski was toiling away at Decalogue, one of the most bizarre and strangely symbolic production sagas in Polish film history drew to a close. At the 1988 Cannes Film Festival, Andrzej Żuławski's On the Silver Globe finally saw the light of day, 12 years after it was initially conceived. Żuławski, who had lived in France since his sophomore feature The Devil came under fire from Polish authorities in the early 70s, was invited back to his home country in 1975 and given an effective carte blanche to direct a project of his choosing. The director plumped for an adaptation of the epic, messianic science fiction novel written by his great-uncle Jerzy in 1900. For a year, between 1976 and 77, filming took place across Poland, including in Krakow's underground salt mines, and as far afield as the Caucasus Mountains and the deserts of Mongolia. As the budget boomed, production was halted, first temporarily and then permanently. The footage, ordered to be destroyed, was secretly salvaged by the crew. Nearly a decade later, Żuławski was allowed to finally return to the film, cobbling together new and old footage, redubbing actors who were now living abroad. This rescue effort was somehow successful, and the sprawling 3-hour panorama of human frailty and ambition that Żuławski left us with is a fitting testament to the perseverance of Polish cinema during one of its most challenging eras. That was the Klassiki companion to the cinema of Poland in the 1980s, written and read by Sam Goff. You can find this and other companion articles on our journal at klassiki.online/journal. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to explore some of the films mentioned in this episode.